The 12-year-old girl collapsed against the hospital corridor wall at 2:17 a.m., her small fist pounding against the cardiac intensive care unit's reinforced glass as medical alarms shrieked behind the doors. Ruby Mae Washington's voice cracked as she shouted surgical terminology that no homeless child should ever know. "His ejection fraction is dropping below 30%. Why aren't you starting the epinephrine drip?" This wasn't supposed to be a street kid diagnosing heart failure. Nurses froze mid-stride, their clipboards clattering to the linoleum floor as they stared at the barefoot girl whose medical knowledge rivaled their own. "Doctor." Martinez stumbled backward, her coffee mug shattering against the wall in a cascade of brown liquid and ceramic shards. Through the observation window, 8-year-old Marcus Washington lay motionless on the surgical table, his dark skin ashen against white sheets that Ruby had tucked around him just hours earlier when he'd whispered, "I'm scared, sissy." The boy, who'd never seen the inside of a proper school, was dying while his sister displayed impossible expertise. "Get security up here now," the head nurse commanded, though her hands trembled as she reached for her radio. How did a child from Detroit's abandoned ruins know more about cardiac surgery than trained professionals? And why was she counting down the exact minutes until her brother would flatline? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 3 months earlier, Ruby Mae Washington had pressed her face against the chain-link fence surrounding Whitmore Academy, watching through autumn leaves as Birmingham's privileged children moved across manicured lawns with the casual confidence that comes from never doubting your place in the world. The elite private school rose like a cathedral of learning from perfectly trimmed grounds, its Gothic spires piercing Alabama sky in a testament to educational excellence that girls like Ruby were never meant to touch. Her grandmother Ethel sat 20 feet away on a bus stop bench, her weathered hands clutching a plastic bag containing everything they owned. At 68, Ethel Washington carried the weight of family secrets that stretched back generations, Cherokee healing traditions mixed with Southern Gothic mysteries that she'd whispered to Ruby during their coldest nights in Detroit's abandoned Packard plant. The old woman's eyes held depths of knowledge about things that couldn't be taught in classrooms, about bloodlines that connected past trauma to present gifts in ways that defied explanation. "Child, you got the sight," Ethel would say whenever Ruby's dreams proved unnaturally accurate. "Same as your great-great-grandmother had before they tried to kill it out of our line." Ruby never understood what her grandmother meant, but the vivid nightmares that showed people's deaths down to the exact minute had been her constant companion since age 5. 40 miles away in Birmingham's exclusive Mountain Brook district, Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore sat in her father's mansion study, surrounded by every educational advantage money could provide, yet feeling more lost than Ruby ever had on Detroit's empty streets. The 11-year-old struggled through another session with her expensive private tutor, watching letters swim across pages like black insects she couldn't catch. Her autism had been misdiagnosed as a learning disability, leaving her brilliant mind trapped behind neurological differences that no one understood. James Whitmore II built his tech empire on innovation and precision, but he couldn't decode the mystery of his daughter's struggles. Each failed report card felt like a personal judgment on his parenting, especially since his wife's death 5 years earlier had left him navigating fatherhood alone. What James didn't know was that his family's wealth had been built on blood money. His father's participation in Thomas Washington's 1983 lynching had stolen research that became the foundation of Whitmore Industries. Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood walked the empty halls of Whitmore Academy each evening, her footsteps echoing off walls lined with portraits of distinguished alumni. At 62, The former headmistress ruled the prestigious institution from her retirement, but terminal heart disease was claiming her body as surely as guilt was consuming her soul. Hidden in her bedroom closet was a trunk containing Thomas Washington's blood-stained shirt and a birth certificate she'd never shown anyone. Proof that Ruby Mae Washington was her own granddaughter, the mixed-race child of a forbidden love affair she'd buried in shame 40 years ago. The threads connecting these 4 lives were about to be pulled tight by forces none of them could control, setting in motion events that would challenge everything they believed about family, redemption, and the price of historical sins. The first time Ruby Mae Washington saw Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore, the girl was sobbing behind a dumpster after being publicly humiliated in front of her classmates' parents. It was a crisp October afternoon when Ruby had wandered farther from downtown Birmingham than usual, drawn by the towering spires of Whitmore Academy like a moth to forbidden flame. She'd heard whispers about the elite school where children arrived in cars worth more than entire city blocks, where textbooks weren't held together with duct tape and dreams weren't considered luxuries the poor couldn't afford. Ruby pressed herself against the wrought iron fence, memorizing mathematical equations visible through an open classroom window when she heard the devastating sound of a child's world collapsing. Following the sobs around the corner of the pristine building, she discovered a girl about her own age huddled behind the maintenance area, clutching a crumpled test paper to her chest like a shield against judgment. And the girl's blonde hair was perfectly styled, her navy blazer immaculate, but tears streaked her face in a way that made Ruby's heart clench with recognition. Pain looked identical, whether you wore designer uniforms or thrift store rags, whether you lived in mansions or abandoned factories. "Hey," Ruby called softly, approaching with the careful movement she'd learned around wounded animals in Detroit's ruins. "You okay?" Sarah looked up, startled, her blue eyes wide with embarrassment and something deeper, shame that Ruby recognized from her own reflection. "You're not supposed to be here," she whispered, glancing nervously toward the main building. "This is private property." Ruby should have run. Trespassing at a place like Whitmore Academy could mean police, juvenile detention, questions she couldn't answer about why a 12-year-old wasn't in school herself. Instead, she settled onto the concrete steps beside Sarah, close enough to offer comfort, but far enough to avoid making the privileged girl more uncomfortable. "I know," Ruby said simply, her voice carrying the wisdom that comes from surviving impossible circumstances. "But sometimes you need to be somewhere you don't belong to find what you're looking for." She nodded toward the crumpled paper in Sarah's hands. "Math test?" Sarah's face crumpled again, and Ruby caught a glimpse of the bright red F circled in harsh strokes across the page. "I failed again. Mrs. Henderson called me slow in front of everyone's parents during the academic showcase. My dad spent $50,000 on tutors this year, and I'm still the stupidest kid in class." Ruby studied the test with her photographic memory, immediately identifying the problem. The questions were straightforward, but they were presented in the abstract way that left visual learners drowning in numbers without context or meaning. Sarah wasn't stupid. She was autistic, processing information in patterns that traditional education systematically ignored. "Can I see that for a second?" Ruby asked gently. Hesitantly, Sarah handed over the test. Ruby scanned the problems, then looked around the small courtyard until her eyes landed on the oak tree dropping its autumn bounty. She gathered handfuls of different colored leaves: red maple, yellow birch, orange oak, brown elm. "Forget everything your teacher told you about fractions," Ruby said, arranging the leaves on concrete between them with mathematical precision. "Pretend these leaves are pizza slices. If you have 4 slices and eat one, what fraction did you eat?" Sarah wiped her nose with the back of her hand, focusing on the colorful arrangement. 1 out of 4? Exactly. 1/4. 1/4. Same concept, different words. Ruby moved the leaves into new combinations, her movements deliberate and patient. Now watch this. If your friend has 8 slices and eats 2, she ate 2/8. But look at the pattern. She arranged the leaves to show visual relationships that made abstract concepts concrete. 2 out of 8 is the same as 1 out of 4. They're equivalent fractions because they represent the same amount of the whole pizza. For the first time since Ruby had found her, Sarah's face transformed with understanding. The confusion in her blue eyes cleared like fog lifting from a mirror. "Oh my God, I can actually see it now. The colors make sense. Why couldn't Mrs. Henderson explain it like that?" Ruby shrugged, gathering the leaves into neat piles that reflected her compulsive need for order, a trait inherited from generations of Cherokee women who organized chaos through ritual and precision. "Sometimes people are so educated they forget how to make things simple." Sarah scrambled to her feet as Ruby stood, brushing dirt from worn jeans. "Wait, what's your name? Do you go to school around here?" Ruby hesitated, something in Sarah's voice making her want to stay despite every survival instinct screaming danger. The loneliness in the wealthy girl's question resonated with her own desperate need for connection. "I'm Ruby, and no, I don't go to school anywhere right now." "Will you come back tomorrow?" Sarah asked quickly, her words tumbling together. "Same time? I have another test Friday, and She trailed off, embarrassment coloring her cheeks. "I don't have any real friends here. Everyone thinks I'm stupid because my father had to donate a building to get me admitted." Ruby looked at this girl who possessed everything money could buy but lacked the one thing Ruby treasured most, someone who believed in her potential beyond her circumstances. "Okay," she said softly, "tomorrow. But if anyone asks, you never saw me." 2 weeks later, Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood stood frozen at her office window, her arthritic fingers gripping the mahogany frame until her knuckles turned bone white. The scene unfolding beneath the oak tree in her academy's pristine courtyard sent ice racing through her 70-year-old veins, not because a homeless child had somehow breached their security, but because that child's face was a ghost from her most carefully buried secret. The girl teaching Sarah Whitmore possessed the same intelligent dark eyes, the same determined jawline, the same natural grace that had once belonged to her own daughter Celia, the mixed-race child she'd abandoned at birth 40 years ago to preserve her social standing in Birmingham's elite circles. Mrs. Blackwood's trembling hand reached for her private phone, the one she used for matters requiring absolute discretion. Her first call was to Harold Morrison, head of Academy Security, a former police officer whose loyalty could be purchased with the right combination of money and veiled threats about his daughter's college funding. "There's a security breach on the grounds," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos erupting in her chest. "A young black girl, maybe 12, conducting unauthorized interactions with one of our students. I want her removed immediately, and I want her complete background within 24 hours. But even as she spoke the words, Mrs. Blackwood felt something crack inside her chest that had nothing to do with her failing heart. Through her high-powered binoculars, she watched Ruby arrange fallen leaves into perfect mathematical patterns while Sarah leaned in with rapt attention, and the sight triggered memories she'd spent decades suppressing. That night, Mrs. Blackwood sat alone in her Victorian mansion in Birmingham's historic district, surrounded by photographs of distinguished alumni and commendation plaques that had once filled her with pride. Now they felt like monuments to a lie she'd been living since 1971. She pulled out a manila folder from her locked desk drawer, a folder she'd hidden even from herself for years, and spread its contents across her mahogany dining table. The birth certificate was yellowed with age, baby girl Washington, born to Celia Washington and father unknown. But Mrs. Blackwood knew who the father was. Thomas Washington, the brilliant young man she'd destroyed with false accusations of academic dishonesty in 1983, 12 years after abandoning their daughter to an orphanage. The cruel mathematics of it made her physically sick. She'd fallen in love with Thomas when he tutored her privately in advanced chemistry, their affair hidden from a world that would have destroyed them both. When she discovered her pregnancy, she'd chosen her career and social status over love, giving birth in secret and abandoning the baby to protect her reputation. Then, when Thomas had excelled academically and threatened to outshine the white students at her sister academy, she'd manufactured the cheating scandal that destroyed his scholarship and future. She'd told herself she was protecting institutional standards, but the truth was simpler and more poisonous. She couldn't bear the thought of the man she'd once loved succeeding without her, couldn't stand seeing him rise above the poverty she'd condemned their daughter to endure. Now that daughter's child was teaching mathematics under her school's oak tree, displaying the same intellectual gifts that had made Mrs. Blackwood fall in love with Thomas Washington 5 decades ago. Harold Morrison's report arrived the next morning, confirming her worst fears. Ruby Mae Washington, granddaughter of Thomas Washington, living in Detroit's ruins with her elderly grandmother. Her mother Celia had died of a drug overdose 3 years earlier, but not before giving birth to Ruby and her younger brother Marcus, who suffered from a severe heart condition that the family couldn't afford to treat. The photograph Morrison included made Mrs. Blackwood's hands shake violently. Ruby was identical to how Celia had looked at that age, the daughter Mrs. Blackwood had glimpsed only once through a social worker's office window before her courage failed and she drove away, leaving her child to the mercy of an overwhelmed system. But there was something else in Morrison's report that made her blood run cold. Ruby wasn't just intellectually gifted. She'd been teaching herself advanced medical procedures by sneaking into Detroit General Hospital at night, studying surgical techniques while her brother Marcus underwent repeated cardiac evaluations they couldn't afford. She knows more about pediatric cardiology than most residents, Dr. Martinez had told Morrison during his investigation. The nurses have caught her in the cardiac unit multiple times, but she's never caused trouble. Just watches, like she's memorizing everything. Mrs. Blackwood closed her eyes, seeing Thomas Washington's face in her memory. The devastation when the cheating accusations were made public, the way his scholarship dreams crumbled under manufactured evidence, the quiet dignity with which he'd accepted his fate. He'd died 10 years later of a heart attack, worn down by construction work and dreams deferred, never knowing he had a granddaughter who inherited his brilliant mind. That afternoon, she watched through her window as James Whitmore III's black Mercedes pulled into the parking lot earlier than usual. Through her binoculars, she could see him gathering his briefcase and phone, moving with the purposeful stride of a man who'd built an empire on making quick decisions. His family's wealth had been built partially on the research his father had stolen from Thomas Washington after orchestrating his lynching, though James remained ignorant of that dark connection. He was walking straight toward the oak tree where his daughter sat, learning from the granddaughter of the man his family had destroyed. Mrs. Blackwood reached for her phone to call security, to stop this confrontation before it could expose the web of lies and historical trauma that connected all their lives. But her fingers froze over the keypad as she realized something that made her chest tighten with more than just heart disease. For 40 years, she'd been running from the consequences of her choices. She'd abandoned her daughter, destroyed the father of her child, and built her career on the foundation of other people's broken dreams. Now her granddaughter was reaching for the same educational opportunities Mrs. Blackwood had spent decades denying to children who reminded her of her own buried shame. As James approached the oak tree, Mrs. Blackwood made a decision that would shatter everything she'd spent her lifetime protecting. She picked up her phone, but instead of calling security, she dialed a different number, one that would finally force her to face the truth about who she really was. The daily lessons beneath the oak tree had transformed both girls in ways that defied every educational theory James Whitmore III thought he understood. But it was Ruby's inexplicable medical knowledge that first made him question whether his daughter was truly safe. Sarah's academic transformation was miraculous by any measure. The girl who had once sat paralyzed in mathematics class, tears streaming down her face as numbers swam incomprehensibly across worksheets, now solved complex algebraic equations while explaining her process in terms of color patterns and spatial relationships. Her teachers whispered among themselves about sudden breakthroughs that bordered on the supernatural. But Sarah knew the truth. Ruby didn't just teach mathematics, she taught a completely different language for understanding the world. "Look at the equation like it's a story," Ruby would say, arranging fallen leaves into mathematical relationships. "The X is a mystery character, and your job is to figure out who they are by following the clues the numbers give you." Sarah's autism, previously seen as an educational obstacle, became her superpower under Ruby's guidance. Her pattern recognition abilities and visual thinking style finally had a teacher who understood that different minds required different keys. But it was during their third week together that Ruby revealed knowledge that made James's blood run cold. "Sarah, does your chest ever hurt after you run?" Ruby asked one afternoon, her dark eyes studying Sarah with the intensity of a medical professional. "Like a fluttering feeling, or like your heart skips beats?" Sarah paused in her geometry problem, surprised by the question. "Sometimes." "Why?" Ruby moved closer, her small hands gently pressing against Sarah's wrist to check her pulse. "Your heart rate is irregular. See how it goes fast, fast, pause, fast, fast, pause. That's called an arrhythmia. You should tell your father to have you see a cardiologist." James, who had been watching from his office window, felt ice form in his stomach. A 12-year-old homeless girl was diagnosing his daughter's heart condition with more precision than their family physician had shown during Sarah's last physical. When he researched Sarah's symptoms that night, Ruby's assessment proved devastatingly accurate. Sarah had a mild mitral valve prolapse that had gone undiagnosed for years. But Ruby's medical knowledge extended far beyond basic cardiology. She knew the exact names and dosages of medications, understood surgical procedures in frightening detail, and could identify symptoms that would challenge medical residents. When James hired a private investigator to research Ruby's background, the findings raised more questions than they answered. "The girl's been sneaking into Detroit General Hospital for over 2 years, Morrison reported during their confidential meeting. "Security guards know her by name, but they don't stop her because she never causes trouble. She just observes. Nurses say she can predict which patients won't make it through the night with uncanny accuracy." The investigators' photographs showed Ruby in hospital corridors at all hours, sometimes carrying her younger brother Marcus, sometimes alone with a worn notebook where she sketched anatomical diagrams with professional precision. Most disturbing were the images of her in the cardiac intensive care unit, standing vigil beside dying children while their families slept in waiting rooms. "How does a street kid know more about pediatric medicine than most doctors?" James asked, staring at surveillance footage of Ruby correctly identifying a child's symptoms before the medical staff reached the same conclusion. Morrison's expression was grim. "That's not the strangest part. The hospital staff say she sometimes knows things she shouldn't be able to know. Like which patients have rare blood types or which ones are scheduled for emergency surgery before the families are even notified. It's like she can sense death approaching." Meanwhile, Ruby's influence on Sarah extended far beyond academics. The lonely, insecure girl who had once hidden during social events now spoke with confidence about mathematical concepts, defended classmates with learning differences, and challenged teachers who used outdated educational methods. Sarah had found not just a tutor, but a sister, someone who understood what it felt like to be different in a world designed for conformity. Ruby says being different isn't a problem to be fixed, Sarah told her father one evening. It's a superpower to be understood. She says the world needs people who think in colors and patterns because we see solutions that regular thinkers miss. James watched his daughter bloom under Ruby's influence, but he also noticed troubling changes. Sarah had begun asking uncomfortable questions about privilege, about why some children lived in mansions while others lived in abandoned buildings, about whether their family's wealth came from helping people or exploiting them. Ruby had awakened not just Sarah's intellectual gifts, but her social consciousness. The confrontation James had been dreading finally came on a gray November afternoon. He arrived at the academy early, intending to observe the girls' lesson from a distance, but what he witnessed made him question everything he thought he knew about education and human potential. Ruby was teaching Sarah about the cardiovascular system using props she'd gathered from around campus: red maple leaves for arteries, blue oak leaves for veins, yellow birch leaves for the heart chambers. But her explanation was so medically precise that James found himself taking notes on his phone. The mitral valve is like a one-way door between your heart's upper and lower left chambers, Ruby explained, demonstrating with her hands. When it doesn't close properly, like yours doesn't, blood flows backward instead of forward. That's why you feel fluttering. Your heart has to work harder to pump the same amount of blood. Sarah listened with rapt attention, her blue eyes bright with understanding. Is it dangerous? Ruby's expression was serious but reassuring. Not immediately, but you'll need to avoid certain medications and have regular checkups. Some people need surgery eventually, but many live normal lives with proper monitoring. James stepped out from behind the building, unable to remain hidden any longer. Excuse me, he called, his voice carrying the authority that had built his business empire. I need to speak with both of you. Ruby immediately stood, positioning herself protectively between James and Sarah. Her small frame couldn't possibly intimidate a grown man, but something in her posture, the straight spine, the lifted chin, the fearless eyes, commanded respect. Mr. Whitmore, Ruby said calmly, I know you're upset about me being here, but Sarah needed help that her regular teachers couldn't provide. I haven't hurt her or taken anything from your school. James studied this remarkable child who spoke with the confidence of someone 3 times her age. Where did you learn about heart conditions? About medical terminology that most adults don't understand? Ruby's expression didn't change. I taught myself. My little brother Marcus has a serious heart defect, and I needed to understand his condition to help take care of him. I've been studying medical textbooks since I was 8. You taught yourself cardiology from textbooks? James's skepticism was evident. That's not possible for someone your age. I have a photographic memory, Ruby replied simply. I remember everything I read, hear, or see. It's not that unusual. About 1 in every 10,000 people have some form of eidetic memory. Sarah stood up beside Ruby, her face flushed with emotion. Daddy, you should see what Ruby can do. She knows more about how my brain works than any of my tutors. She doesn't think I'm broken or stupid. She thinks I'm gifted. James looked between the 2 girls, his privileged daughter defending a homeless child, and that child displaying intellectual gifts that challenged everything he understood about education and social class. The comfortable assumptions about merit, opportunity, and natural talent that had shaped his worldview were crumbling under the weight of this encounter. Ruby, he said carefully, if you're as brilliant as you appear to be, why aren't you in school? Why aren't there programs to help gifted children like you? Ruby's laugh was bitter beyond her years. Gifted programs are for kids whose parents can advocate for them, Mr. Whitmore. Poor kids who are smart get labeled as trouble or too big for their britches. We get punished for asking questions that make adults uncomfortable. She gestured toward the imposing academy building behind them. "This school costs more per year than my family has ever had in total. You think there's a place here for a girl whose grandmother picks through dumpsters to find her textbooks?" James felt something crack open in his chest. Not just sympathy, but recognition of a profound injustice that his privilege had previously made invisible. Here was a child whose intellectual gifts surpassed those of students whose families paid six-figure tuitions, yet she was denied access to educational opportunities based purely on economic circumstances beyond her control. "What if there was a place for you here?" James asked impulsively. "What if we could find a way to get you enrolled?" Ruby's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "I don't take charity, Mr. Whitmore, and I won't be anyone's project to make them feel good about helping the disadvantaged." "It wouldn't be charity," James replied, though he wasn't sure what it would be. "It would be recognition, investment in exceptional talent." Mrs. Blackwood's voice cut through the afternoon air like a blade. "Mr. Whitmore, I believe we need to discuss this situation in my office immediately." The elderly woman approached with the regal bearing that had intimidated generations of students and parents, but James noticed something different in her expression, not just authority, but desperation. Behind her walked Harold Morrison and two security guards, their presence clearly intended to remove Ruby from the premises. "Mrs. Blackwood," James said firmly, "I'd like to continue this conversation with Ruby present. She's clearly an exceptional student who could benefit our educational community." Mrs. Blackwood's face went pale. "Mr. Whitmore, there are complications you're not aware of. Background issues that make this situation more complex than it appears." Ruby stepped forward, her young face set with determination that reminded James uncomfortably of his own daughter when Sarah had made up her mind about something. "What kind of complications? What aren't you telling us?" The silence that followed was heavy with secrets that had been buried for decades, lies that had shaped lives and destroyed dreams, connections that none of them fully understood, but all of them were about to discover. Mrs. Blackwood looked at Ruby with an expression that combined love, guilt, and terror in equal measure. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "Child, there are some truths that change everything once they're spoken. Are you sure you want to know?" The truth detonated in the pristine courtyard of Whitmore Academy like a bomb that had been buried for 40 years, finally triggered by the collision of past sins and present reckoning. Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood stood trembling beneath the oak tree, her carefully maintained composure cracking under the weight of secrets that had shaped every decision she'd made since 1971. The manila folder in her arthritic hands contained documents that would destroy not just her reputation, but the comfortable lies that had allowed everyone present to sleep peacefully for decades. "Ruby Mae Washington," she began, her voice barely audible above the autumn wind. "You are my granddaughter." The words hit the small group like physical blows. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. James stepped backward as if struck, but Ruby remained perfectly still, her dark eyes studying Mrs. Blackwood with the intensity of someone who had suspected this truth in ways she couldn't name. "In 1971, I was a young teacher at Jefferson Academy," Mrs. Blackwood continued, her words gaining strength as she finally unburdened herself of 4 decades of guilt. "I fell in love with one of my private tutoring students, Thomas Washington, your grandfather. He was brilliant, more brilliant than any student I'd ever encountered, but he was black and I was white. And in Alabama in 1971, such relationships could destroy both participants." Ruby's hands clenched into fists. "You're telling me my grandfather was your lover?" "I was 22, he was 19, and we both knew our relationship was impossible," Mrs. Blackwood replied, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. When I discovered I was pregnant, I had to choose between love and survival. I chose survival. I gave birth in secret and abandoned your mother Celia to an orphanage, telling myself she'd have better opportunities without the stigma of our affair. James felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. Eleanor, you're saying you had a child with Thomas Washington? The same Thomas Washington whose research my father— He stopped abruptly, his face draining of color as he realized the implications. Mrs. Blackwood's expression hardened. Yes, James? The same Thomas Washington your father murdered in 1983 after stealing his revolutionary cardiac research. The research that became the foundation of Whitmore Industries' medical division. Ruby's world exploded into fragments of understanding that cut like shrapnel through her carefully constructed sense of identity. My grandfather was murdered? You're telling me he didn't die of a heart attack? He was lynched by a group that included James's father, Robert Whitmore, Mrs. Blackwood said, her voice now steady with the terrible relief of confession. Thomas had developed breakthrough treatments for pediatric heart conditions, treatments that would have saved thousands of children's lives. But Robert Whitmore and his associates couldn't allow a black man to receive credit for such important medical advances. James staggered backward, his expensive suit rumpled, his face ashen. That's impossible. My father was a respected businessman. He wasn't capable of— Murder? Mrs. Blackwood's laugh was bitter. Your father was capable of anything that protected white supremacy and increased his wealth. After Thomas's death, Robert stole his research notes and patents, built Whitmore Industries on that stolen intellectual property, and made sure the true inventor was erased from history. Sarah, who had been listening with growing horror, finally found her voice. Ruby, that means your grandfather's work is what paid for our house, our cars, my school. She turned to her father with accusation burning in her blue eyes. Everything we have came from murdering Ruby's family? Ruby felt something dark and terrible rising in her chest. Not just grief for a grandfather she'd never known, but rage at the systematic theft of her family's legacy. That's why I know so much about heart surgery, she said quietly, pieces of her identity rearranging themselves into a new, painful pattern. It's in my blood. My grandfather's research, his knowledge, his passion for saving children with heart conditions, it's genetic memory. Mrs. Blackwood nodded through her tears. Thomas specialized in pediatric cardiology because his own younger brother died of a heart defect when they were children. He was determined that no family would suffer that loss if he could prevent it. When I destroyed his career with false cheating accusations 12 years later, I wasn't just protecting institutional racism. I was covering my own guilt about abandoning our daughter. The magnitude of the interconnected betrayals was staggering. And Mrs. Blackwood had abandoned her daughter to protect her career, then destroyed Thomas Washington to hide her shame about their affair. Robert Whitmore had murdered Thomas to steal his research and maintain white supremacy, and now Ruby, the genetic inheritor of Thomas's brilliance and passion, was living in poverty while James's family enjoyed wealth built on her grandfather's blood. "Where is my mother now?" Ruby asked, though something in Mrs. Blackwood's expression already provided the answer. "Celia died 3 years ago of a drug overdose in Detroit," Mrs. Blackwood whispered. "I found her too late. I'd been searching for her since 1989, trying to make amends, but the damage was already done. The foster care system, the poverty, the trauma of abandonment, it broke something inside her that I could never repair." Ruby absorbed this blow with the stoic endurance she'd learned from surviving impossible circumstances. "So my mother died, never knowing she had family who could have helped her?" "I was a coward," Mrs. Blackwood admitted. "Even when I found her, I was too ashamed to reveal our connection. I sent anonymous money, arranged for apartment deposits, tried to help from the shadows, but what she needed was a mother, and I was too selfish to risk my reputation by admitting my past. James, who had been listening with growing desperation, finally spoke. "Ruby, I had no idea about my father's involvement in your grandfather's death. If I had known—" "Would it have mattered?" Ruby interrupted, her voice cutting through his protests. "Would you have given up your wealth? Would you have sought out Thomas Washington's descendants to make amends? Or would you have done what you're probably planning to do right now, throw money at the problem to make your guilt go away?" The accuracy of her assessment hit James like a physical blow. His businessman's mind had already been calculating scholarship amounts, trust fund figures, ways to convert his moral debt into financial transactions that would allow him to sleep at night. "You're right," he admitted quietly. "I was already thinking about how much money it would take to balance the scales. But money can't bring back your grandfather or your mother. Money can't erase the fact that my family's prosperity is built on your family's destruction." Sarah, who had been processing the revelations with her autistic mind's need for concrete understanding, suddenly spoke with clarity that surprised everyone. "Ruby, this means we're connected by murder and love at the same time. Your grandfather loved Mrs. Blackwood, but my grandfather killed yours." "How do we even begin to understand that?" Ruby looked at Sarah, this privileged white girl who had become her closest friend, whose father's wealth came from her family's blood, and felt the impossible complexity of human relationships in all their brutal, beautiful contradiction. "I don't know," Ruby said honestly. "I don't know if we can be friends when your family destroyed mine. I don't know if I can learn in a school built on my grandfather's stolen dreams. I don't know if forgiveness is even possible when the wounds run this deep." Mrs. Blackwood stepped forward, her terminal heart disease making each movement painful. "Ruby, I'm dying. The doctors say I have perhaps weeks, not months. I can't undo the choices I made, can't bring back the people I failed to protect, can't repair the trust I shattered. But I can give you something that belongs to you by right." She opened the manila folder and pulled out a thick document, Thomas Washington's original research notes, handwritten in the precise script Ruby had inherited, detailing revolutionary treatments for pediatric heart conditions that could save children like her brother Marcus. "This is your grandfather's real work," Mrs. Blackwood said, placing the papers in Ruby's hands. "Not the sanitized, stolen version that made the Whitmores rich, but his actual research, his methodology, his dreams for healing children who couldn't afford traditional treatment." Ruby stared at the papers, seeing her grandfather's handwriting for the first time, recognizing the same precise diagrams she drew in her own notebooks, understanding finally why her medical knowledge felt like memory rather than learning. "He wrote about you," Mrs. Blackwood whispered. "Not you specifically, but about the descendants he hoped would continue his work. He believed healing was a calling that passed through bloodlines, that his children and grandchildren would carry forward his mission of saving hearts that others had written off as hopeless." Ruby looked up from the papers to find James, Sarah, and Mrs. Blackwood watching her with expressions of hope, guilt, and desperate need for redemption. The weight of 3 generations of secrets, lies, love, and murder pressed down on her 12-year-old shoulders. In her hands she held the power to forgive or condemn, to heal or destroy, to bridge the chasm of historical trauma or let it swallow them all. The oak tree whispered above them in the autumn wind, and Ruby realized that her next words would determine not just her own future, but the possibility of redemption for everyone standing in its shadow. The phone call that shattered Ruby's fragile new world came at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday night, 3 weeks after the revelations under the oak tree had rewritten the story of her life. Ruby fumbled for the cracked cell phone James had given her, instantly alert despite the late hour. Years of caring for her sick brother had trained her to wake at the first sign of emergency, and the hospital's number flashing on the screen confirmed her worst fears. "Miss Washington, this is Dr. Martinez from Detroit General Hospital." The voice was professional but strained, carrying the weight of news that would destroy someone's world. "Your brother Marcus was brought in by ambulance 40 minutes ago. His condition has deteriorated rapidly, and I need you here immediately." Ruby's hands shook as she processed the words. Marcus had been stable when she'd left Detroit to temporarily stay with Mrs. Blackwood, who had insisted on housing her while they navigated the complex legalities of Ruby's enrollment at Whitmore Academy. Her grandmother Ethel had been caring for Marcus, following the strict medication schedule Ruby had established. "How bad is it?" Ruby asked, though her medical knowledge already provided terrifying answers based on the urgency in Dr. Martinez's voice. "His ejection fraction has dropped to 15%. We're looking at complete heart failure within 72 hours without immediate intervention." Dr. Martinez paused, choosing her words carefully. "Ruby, he needs a heart transplant, or at minimum a ventricular assist device to keep him alive until we can find a donor. The surgery alone costs close to $200,000. Ruby felt the familiar weight of impossible mathematics crushing her chest. Even with James's scholarship covering her education, even with Mrs. Blackwood's guilt-driven financial support, $200,000 might as well have been $2 million. Her family had never possessed that kind of money, would never possess it under any circumstances she could imagine. "I'll be there in 4 hours," Ruby said, her voice steady despite the chaos erupting in her heart. "Don't let him die. Whatever it takes, don't let him die." The drive from Birmingham to Detroit passed in a blur of highway lights and desperate prayers. Mrs. Blackwood, despite her own failing health, insisted on accompanying Ruby, her chauffeur navigating the dark interstate while Ruby sat rigid in the back seat, memorizing everything she could find about pediatric heart transplants on her phone. They arrived at Detroit General Hospital to find Marcus unconscious in the cardiac intensive care unit, surrounded by machines that monitored every faltering beat of his 8-year-old heart. Ruby pressed her face against the observation window, seeing her little brother's small body dwarfed by medical equipment that represented more money than their family had earned in their entire lives. Dr. Martinez found her there at dawn, still watching Marcus breathe with mechanical assistance. "Ruby, we need to discuss options," the doctor said gently. "Marcus is on the transplant list, but given his age, blood type, and the scarcity of pediatric donors, the wait time could be months or years. The ventricular assist device could keep him alive during that wait, but we can't afford it," Ruby finished, her voice hollow with defeat. Dr. Martinez nodded reluctantly. "Hospital policy requires payment guarantees for procedures this expensive. Without insurance or substantial financial backing, our hands are tied." Ruby stared at her brother's unconscious form, feeling the weight of systemic injustice crushing her dreams like autumn leaves under heavy boots. Marcus was dying, not because medical science couldn't save him, but because their family's poverty made his life less valuable than those of children whose parents could write 6-figure checks. "What if someone else paid for it?" Ruby asked quietly. "If you can secure funding, we can schedule the surgery immediately," Dr. Martinez replied. "But Ruby, that's an enormous amount of money. Even wealthy families struggle with costs like these." Ruby pulled out her phone and dialed James's number, her fingers trembling as she prepared to make the most difficult call of her life. When he answered on the second ring, his voice thick with sleep, Ruby nearly broke down. "Mr. Whitmore, I need help," she said, the words feeling like glass in her throat. "Marcus is dying, and I don't have anywhere else to turn." The silence on the line stretched for eternal seconds before James responded. "Tell me what you need." Ruby explained Marcus's condition, the surgical requirements, the impossible cost. With each word, she felt pieces of her pride crumbling, her fierce independence dissolving under the weight of love for her dying brother. "Ruby, of course I'll pay for the surgery," James said immediately. Transfer him to Birmingham's Children's Hospital. They have better pediatric cardiac facilities, and I'll handle all the arrangements." "No," Ruby said firmly, surprising them both with the strength in her voice. "If you help us, it's a loan, not charity. I'll pay you back every dollar, with interest, even if it takes my entire lifetime." James was quiet for a moment, understanding that Ruby's pride was as essential to her identity as her intelligence. "Agreed. We'll draw up proper loan documents. But Ruby, right now the only thing that matters is saving Marcus." Within 6 hours, Marcus was stabilized and transferred to Birmingham Children's Hospital in a medical helicopter that cost more than Ruby's family had ever seen in one place. The pediatric cardiac surgery team, led by Dr. Patricia Chen, the region's most respected specialist, examined Marcus and confirmed that the ventricular assist device would keep him alive until a donor heart became available. As Ruby watched medical professionals mobilize resources that represented more wealth than entire neighborhoods possessed, she grappled with the moral complexity of accepting help from a family whose prosperity was built on her grandfather's murder. Every machine keeping Marcus alive, every medication flowing through his IV, every moment of expert medical care was purchased with blood money, the profits from stolen research that should have belonged to Thomas Washington's descendants. Sarah arrived at the hospital that evening, her face streaked with tears as she saw Marcus for the first time. The 8-year-old boy looked impossibly small in the pediatric ICU, his dark skin ashen against white sheets, his breathing assisted by machines that hummed with mechanical precision. "He looks like you did when you were little," Sarah whispered to Ruby, studying Marcus's delicate features. "Same intelligent eyes, same stubborn chin." Ruby managed a weak smile. "He's the smartest kid I know. Taught himself to read from street signs and newspaper headlines. Dreams of becoming a doctor so he can help other kids who can't afford medical care." Mrs. Blackwood, who had been quietly observing from the corner, stepped forward with difficulty. Her terminal heart condition made every movement painful, but her eyes were bright with determination. "Ruby," she said softly, "I want Marcus to have something that belonged to your grandfather." She pulled out a small leather journal, Thomas Washington's personal medical diary, filled with observations about treating heart conditions in children from poor families. The handwriting was identical to Ruby's, the diagram showing the same precise attention to anatomical detail. "Thomas wrote this while he was developing his revolutionary treatments," Mrs. Blackwood explained. "He believed that healing was a sacred calling, that medical knowledge should serve the most vulnerable members of society, not just those who could afford premium care." Ruby accepted the journal with trembling hands, feeling the weight of her grandfather's dreams and her brother's future pressing against her chest. As she opened to the first page, she found an inscription that made her breath catch. "For my descendants, who will carry forward the work of healing hearts that others have abandoned. Remember that love is the most powerful medicine, and justice is the highest calling of those who possess the gift to heal." The words seemed to glow on the yellowed paper, connecting her to a legacy that transcended the trauma of murder and abandonment. Thomas Washington had known his work would continue through his bloodline, had trusted that future generations would honor his mission of saving children who couldn't save themselves. Outside Marcus's room, machines continued their electronic symphony, measuring heartbeats that hung between life and death. Ruby pressed her grandfather's journal to her chest and made a silent promise that would shape the rest of her life. She would become the doctor Thomas Washington had dreamed of being, would heal children that the medical establishment had written off as hopeless, would transform her family's tragedy into triumph that honored both the dead and the living. But first, she had to save the little boy whose heart carried the genetic memory of greatness, whose survival would determine whether love or hatred would define their family's future. The conspiracy Ruby uncovered in the sterile corridors of Detroit General Hospital made her blood run cold with a terror that went beyond her brother's medical crisis. She had stumbled upon a systematic murder operation disguised as pediatric health care. It began with a conversation she wasn't supposed to overhear. 3 days after Marcus's successful ventricular assist device surgery, Ruby was studying her grandfather's medical journal in the hospital's family lounge when Dr. Richard Kessler's voice carried through the thin partition wall. "The Washington boy is stable, but his blood type makes him perfect for the Morrison donation," Kessler was saying to someone Ruby couldn't see. "Senator Morrison's grandson needs a heart within the month, and this kid's family can't afford the ongoing care anyway. We let nature take its course, harvest what we need, and everyone wins." Ruby's hands trembled as she pressed closer to the wall, her medical knowledge allowing her to understand the horrifying implications immediately. Dr. Kessler was discussing letting Marcus die so his heart could be given to a wealthy family's child. Murder disguised as medical triage. "What about the sister?" asked another voice Ruby recognized as Nurse Patricia Henning. "She's been asking too many questions, knows too much medical terminology for a street kid. 12-year-old girls from the ghetto don't pose threats to medical professionals," Kessler replied dismissively. "Who's going to believe her over us? We've been managing these situations for 5 years without complications." Ruby felt the world tilt around her as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. For 5 years, Detroit General Hospital had been systematically murdering poor children to harvest their organs for wealthy patients who could pay premium prices for priority placement on transplant lists. The medical staff would deliberately sabotage care for disadvantaged patients, allowing them to die during routine procedures, then claim the organs for families who could afford under-the-table payments. Her hands shaking, Ruby pulled out her phone and began recording, capturing Dr. Kessler as he continued outlining the plan to let Marcus die during his next adjustment surgery scheduled for the following morning. "The device will malfunction during routine maintenance," Kessler explained to his conspirator. "His heart will stop. We'll make a show of trying to save him, and within 4 hours his organs will be preserving the life of someone whose family contributed significantly to our research funding." Ruby had heard enough. She slipped out of the family lounge and made her way to Marcus's room, where her little brother lay unconscious, unaware that medical professionals were planning his murder. The machines surrounding his bed, machines paid for by James Whitmore's guilty conscience, were keeping him alive only until wealthy patients needed his organs. Her first call was to James, her voice steady despite the horror coursing through her veins. "Mr. Whitmore, I need Marcus transferred to Birmingham Children's Hospital immediately. Tonight, I can't explain over the phone, but his life is in immediate danger." James didn't question her urgency. Within 2 hours, Marcus was being transported by private medical helicopter while Ruby sat beside his stretcher, clutching audio recordings that could destroy careers and save lives. But she knew the conspiracy extended beyond Detroit General Hospital. The premium organ placement system, Dr. Kessler described, required coordination between multiple hospitals, medical professionals, and wealthy families who paid for priority access to life-saving procedures. The next morning, Ruby sat in James's office with FBI agent Sarah Morrison, ironically sharing the same last name as the family whose child was supposed to receive Marcus's heart. Agent Morrison listened to the recordings with growing outrage, her face hardening as Dr. Kessler's voice detailed the systematic murder of children whose only crime was being born into poverty. "This is a federal conspiracy involving interstate organ trafficking," Agent Morrison said grimly. "These recordings provide evidence of premeditated murder, healthcare fraud, and civil rights violations that could result in life sentences for everyone involved." James, who had been pacing behind his desk, stopped abruptly. "Agent Morrison, I need to ask you something that might sound paranoid, but given what we've discovered about systemic corruption, is your investigation team completely secure? If wealthy families have been paying for priority organ placement, they have resources to compromise federal investigations. Agent Morrison's expression grew even more serious. Mr. Whitmore, you're right to be concerned. The senator whose grandson was supposed to receive Marcus's heart has connections throughout federal law enforcement. We'll need to handle this investigation with extreme care to prevent evidence from disappearing or witnesses from being silenced. Ruby, who had been listening with the focused intensity she brought to all life-or-death situations, spoke up with a clarity that surprised the adults. Agent Morrison, there are other children in immediate danger. Dr. Kessler mentioned 5 years of these operations. That means dozens, maybe hundreds of kids have been murdered for their organs while their families thought they were receiving medical care. The FBI agent nodded grimly. We'll be conducting simultaneous raids on multiple hospitals in 5 states. But Ruby, you and your family are now targets. The people involved in this conspiracy have billions of dollars at stake and won't hesitate to eliminate witnesses. As if summoned by her words, James's secretary knocked urgently on the office door. Mr. Whitmore, there's a Detective Williams from Detroit Police Department on the phone. He says there's been an incident involving Mrs. Blackwood and he needs to speak with Ruby immediately. Ruby's blood turned to ice as she took the phone, already knowing that the conspiracy had claimed another victim. Miss Washington. Detective Williams' voice was heavy with regret. I'm sorry to inform you that Eleanor Blackwood was found dead in her hotel room this morning. Initial investigation suggests heart failure, but given her recent involvement in exposing historical crimes, we're treating this as a suspicious death. Ruby sank into the leather chair beside James's desk, feeling the weight of Mrs. Blackwood's final sacrifice. The elderly woman had known the risks of revealing decades of buried secrets, had understood that powerful families would kill to protect their reputations and wealth. Her death wasn't from natural heart failure. It was murder disguised as medical inevitability. Detective Williams, Ruby said, her voice steady despite the grief crushing her chest. Mrs. Blackwood left me documents that prove my grandfather Thomas Washington was murdered in 1983 by a group that included Robert Whitmore. She also had evidence about illegal medical practices spanning multiple decades. Her death isn't coincidental. Agent Morrison leaned forward, recognizing the expansion of their investigation. Detective Williams, this is FBI Agent Morrison. We're already investigating federal crimes connected to the Washington family. I'll need all evidence from Mrs. Blackwood's death scene secured as part of our case. Over the next 6 hours, the scope of the conspiracy became clear through Mrs. Blackwood's carefully preserved documents. The organ trafficking ring extended back to the 1980s, when wealthy Southern families had first begun paying premium prices for medical priority. Robert Whitmore hadn't just murdered Thomas Washington for his research. He had used that stolen knowledge to establish a network of corrupt medical professionals who provided specialized treatment for those who could afford it while systematically denying care to poor families. The same hospitals that murdered children for their organs had been built with money from Thomas Washington's stolen cardiac research. The same medical professionals who planned Marcus's death had been trained using techniques Thomas developed to save disadvantaged children. The cruel irony made Ruby physically sick. Her grandfather's work to heal the poor had been perverted into a system that killed them for profit. But Mrs. Blackwood's death had not been in vain. Her final act was leaving Ruby a safety deposit box key and detailed instructions about evidence hidden throughout Birmingham's elite social circles. The elderly woman had spent her last weeks gathering proof of crimes committed by families whose children attended Whitmore Academy, whose donations funded the hospital where Marcus now recovered, whose charitable foundations masked systematic exploitation of the poor. She knew they would kill her, Ruby said quietly as she reviewed Mrs. Blackwood's final letter. But she also knew that her death would trigger the investigation that could save other children. She chose to sacrifice herself to break a cycle of murder that had continued for 40 years. James stared out his office window at the Birmingham skyline, seeing his city's gleaming hospitals and elite institutions with new eyes. Ruby, how many other families like yours have been destroyed by this system? How many brilliant children have died so that wealthy families could buy their way to the front of medical waiting lists? Ruby pulled out her grandfather's journal, now supplemented with Mrs. Blackwood's evidence and her own documented proof of the organ trafficking conspiracy. Hundreds, maybe thousands. But now we have the evidence to stop it. Agent Morrison's phone buzzed with updates from coordinated raids happening across 5 states. 17 arrests so far, including 3 hospital administrators, 5 surgeons, and 4 nurses. We've also seized financial records showing millions of dollars in illegal payments for organ priority placement. As evening fell over Birmingham, Ruby sat beside Marcus's hospital bed, watching her little brother sleep peacefully under the protection of federal agents and honest medical professionals. The ventricular assist device pumped steadily, keeping him alive while they waited for a legitimate heart transplant that wouldn't require anyone else's death. She opened Thomas Washington's journal to the final entry, written just days before his murder. The greatest healing comes not from medicine alone, but from justice. When we fight for the lives of those society has abandoned, we honor the sacred trust between healer and patient. My work will continue through those who refuse to accept that poverty is a death sentence. Ruby understood now that her grandfather had foreseen this moment, had known that his descendants would one day face the choice between accepting systemic injustice and fighting to transform it. Mrs. Blackwood's sacrifice, Marcus's survival, and her own discovery of the organ trafficking conspiracy were all connected to Thomas Washington's vision of medicine as a force for social justice rather than elite privilege. Outside Marcus's room, FBI agents coordinated the largest healthcare fraud investigation in American history. Inside, Ruby held her brother's hand and made a silent promise that would define her life's work. She would become the doctor Thomas Washington had dreamed of being, would heal children regardless of their ability to pay, would ensure that no family ever again faced the choice between poverty and watching their loved ones die. The conspiracy that had tried to murder her brother had instead awakened a force more powerful than they could imagine, the righteous anger of a brilliant young woman who understood that healing and justice were inseparable, that medical care was a human right rather than a commodity to be purchased by the wealthy. The resolution came not through dramatic confrontations or tearful reconciliations, but through the quiet courage of truth-telling that transformed individual healing into systemic change. 6 months after the FBI raids that dismantled the organ trafficking conspiracy, Ruby sat in the witness stand of a federal courthouse in Birmingham, her small frame dwarfed by the mahogany panels and marble columns that represented American justice at its most formal. Across the courtroom, Dr. Richard Kessler and 14 co-conspirators faced charges that could result in life imprisonment for their roles in murdering children to harvest organs for wealthy patients. Ruby's testimony was devastating in its clinical precision. She recounted Marcus's case with the medical accuracy she'd inherited from her grandfather's genetic legacy, describing how Dr. Kessler had planned to let her brother die during routine surgery so his heart could be transplanted into Senator Morrison's grandson. Her voice never wavered as she detailed the systematic murder of poor children whose families couldn't afford to challenge medical authority. The defendant told his co-conspirator that Marcus would die during device maintenance, Ruby stated, her dark eyes fixed on Dr. Kessler's face. He said they had been managing these situations for 5 years without complications. When I asked what he meant by managing, he explained that they allowed poor children to die during procedures so their organs could be given to wealthy patients who paid for priority placement. The defense attorney, an expensive Philadelphia lawyer whose fees exceeded most families' annual income, attempted to discredit Ruby's testimony by emphasizing her age and background. Miss Washington, you're asking this jury to believe that a 12-year-old girl from Detroit's most dangerous neighborhoods was capable of understanding complex medical conversations that would challenge trained professionals? Ruby's response silenced the courtroom. Sir, I've been studying pediatric cardiology since I was 8 years old because my brother's life depended on my understanding his condition. I taught myself from medical textbooks because no one else was going to advocate for a poor black child with a heart defect. When you grow up watching your family members die from treatable conditions, you learn medical terminology that most adults will never need to know. The jury of 12 Birmingham residents, 8 white, 4 black, ranging in age from 23 to 67, listened with expressions of growing outrage as Ruby detailed the scope of the conspiracy. The evidence she had gathered, combined with Mrs. Blackwood's posthumously revealed documents, painted a picture of systematic murder that spanned multiple states and involved some of the South's most respected medical institutions. James Whitmore III testified about his family's connection to the conspiracy, his voice heavy with the weight of inherited guilt. My father participated in Thomas Washington's lynching in 1983 and stole his cardiac research to found our medical division, he told the packed courtroom. The same hospitals that were murdering poor children for their organs were built with money from my grandfather's stolen work. Our family's wealth came from destroying the very people Thomas Washington had dedicated his life to healing. The revelations about historical connections between the Whitmore family and systematic racism against the Washington lineage created a media sensation that extended far beyond Alabama. National news networks picked up the story of a 12-year-old girl who had exposed a multi-million-dollar organ trafficking ring while uncovering decades of buried racial violence. Sarah Whitmore, now 13 and thriving under educational methods designed for her autistic learning style, testified about Ruby's transformative influence on her academic and personal development. Ruby taught me that being different isn't a disability, it's a different way of seeing solutions that other people miss, Sarah told the court. She helped me understand that my autism makes me better at recognizing patterns and detecting lies, which is why I could see that the medical system was lying about caring for poor children. The trial's most dramatic moment came when Marcus Washington, now 9 years old and recovering well from his heart surgery, addressed the court about his experience as a planned murder victim. His young voice carried across the silent courtroom as he described trusting doctors who had secretly planned his death. "I thought the doctors were trying to help me get better," Marcus said, his small hand gripping Ruby's as she sat beside him at the witness table. Ruby explained that some of them wanted to take my heart and give it to another kid whose family had more money. I don't understand why anyone would think some kids deserve to live more than others just because of money. The jury deliberated for only 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges for all defendants. Dr. Richard Kessler received 3 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole. Senator Morrison, whose attempt to purchase priority organ placement for his grandson had triggered the investigation, resigned from office and faced additional federal charges for bribery and conspiracy to commit murder. But the legal victory was only the beginning of broader changes that Ruby's courage had set in motion. The federal investigation revealed that organ trafficking conspiracies existed in 17 states, leading to the arrest of over 40 medical professionals and the exposure of systematic discrimination in healthcare that had resulted in hundreds of preventable deaths. Congress passed emergency legislation requiring federal oversight of all organ transplant procedures and establishing whistleblower protections for healthcare workers who reported discrimination. The Thomas Washington Medical Justice Act mandated that hospitals receiving federal funding could not consider patients' financial status when determining treatment priority for life-saving procedures. Ruby's role in exposing the conspiracy made her a national symbol of youth activism and medical advocacy, but she handled the attention with the same quiet dignity that had defined her throughout the crisis. Instead of accepting celebrity status, she focused on her education and her long-term goal of becoming a pediatric cardiologist who would honor her grandfather's legacy of healing marginalized children. At Whitmore Academy, now renamed the Thomas Washington Academy for Educational Excellence, Ruby's teaching methods became part of the standard curriculum for students with learning differences. Her approach to mathematics instruction, which used visual and tactile methods to make abstract concepts concrete, revolutionized how educators understood neurodiversity and learning disabilities. Sarah thrived in this new educational environment, her autism finally recognized as cognitive diversity rather than deficiency. Together, the two girls established a peer tutoring program that paired neurotypical students with autistic classmates, creating collaborative learning relationships that benefited everyone involved. James Whitmore III used his family's wealth to establish the Washington Family Foundation, which provided full scholarships for academically gifted students from disadvantaged backgrounds. The foundation also funded free pediatric cardiac clinics in underserved communities, ensuring that no child would die from heart conditions due to inability to pay for treatment. Mrs. Blackwood's death had not been in vain. Her final act of courage in exposing the conspiracy had triggered systematic changes that saved hundreds of lives. The school board voted unanimously to name the Academy's new Medical Sciences building in her honor, recognizing her transformation from perpetrator of historical injustice to advocate for contemporary healing. Marcus Washington's successful heart transplant, performed by ethical surgeons using a legitimately donated organ, became a symbol of medical care freed from economic discrimination. His recovery inspired legislation requiring hospitals to provide indigent care funding for all children needing life-saving procedures. Ruby's grandmother, Ethel, now living in a comfortable assisted living facility funded by the Washington Family Foundation, kept Thomas Washington's original medical journal in a place of honor beside her bed. At 70, she had lived to see her granddaughter vindicated and her great-grandson saved, witnessing the transformation of generational trauma into systematic healing. The final legal resolution came when the surviving conspirators agreed to establish a victim compensation fund using their seized assets. Families whose children had been murdered by the organ trafficking ring received financial settlements that, while unable to restore lost lives, provided resources for surviving family members to pursue education and healing. Ruby's impact extended beyond legal victories and policy changes to something more profound, the demonstration that children from any background could challenge systems of oppression when armed with knowledge, courage, and community support. Her story became required reading in medical schools across the country, ensuring that future healthcare providers understood their ethical obligations to serve all patients regardless of economic status. As Ruby prepared to begin high school at 15, having accelerated through middle school with academic excellence that surprised no one who knew her, she reflected on the journey that had taken her from Detroit's abandoned ruins to national recognition as a healthcare advocate and educational reformer. The oak tree under which she had first taught Sarah still stood in the Academy's courtyard, now surrounded by a memorial garden dedicated to Thomas Washington and all children whose potential had been destroyed by systematic discrimination. Students gathered there daily to study, teach each other, and continue the work of educational justice that Ruby had begun. In her valedictorian speech at 8th grade graduation, Ruby articulated the vision that would guide her future work. Education is not a privilege to be purchased by the wealthy. It's a human right that belongs to every child regardless of their circumstances. Medicine is not a commodity to be rationed based on ability to pay. It's a sacred trust between healers and those who need healing. When we fight for the most vulnerable members of our society, we honor the best values of democracy and human dignity. The girl who had once pressed her face against academy fences, dreaming of educational opportunities she thought she'd never reach, had become living proof that brilliance transcends circumstances, that justice can emerge from tragedy, and that the most powerful force for social change is often the voice of a child brave enough to tell the truth about systematic oppression. Her grandfather's vision of healing as a form of social justice lived on through Ruby's commitment to ensuring that every child, regardless of race, class, or background, would have access to the education and healthcare necessary to reach their full potential. Message for American seniors. Sometimes the most profound lessons about family, forgiveness, and second chances come from the most unexpected teachers. As we navigate our golden years, many of us carry the weight of decisions made decades ago, moments when societal pressure overcame personal conscience, when we stayed silent instead of speaking up, when fear prevented us from doing what we knew was right. Ruby and Mrs. Blackwood's journey reminds us that redemption is never too late, that the bridges we burned in our youth can still be rebuilt with courage and honesty. Whether you're a grandparent watching brilliant minds in your community go unrecognized, someone who remembers when opportunities were limited by prejudice rather than potential, or a person seeking to make amends for past mistakes, this story speaks to the American values we want to believe in. That talent rises when given the chance, that love transcends boundaries, and that it's never too late to choose justice over comfort. In our neighborhoods today, there are Ruby Washingtons waiting for someone to see their worth, Sarah Whitmores needing authentic connection, and Mrs. Blackwoods seeking the courage to confront historical wrongs before it's too late. Discussion questions. Have you ever had the opportunity to mentor a young person whose background was very different from your own? And how did that experience change your perspective on talent and potential? Looking back on your life, is there a historical injustice or personal wrong you witnessed that you wish you had found the courage to address? Please share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Your wisdom might inspire someone else's journey toward healing and understanding. 5 years after the federal trials that dismantled the organ trafficking conspiracy, Ruby Mae Washington stood at the podium of Johns Hopkins Medical School as the youngest student ever admitted to their prestigious program. At 17, she had completed her undergraduate degree in biomedical engineering with highest honors while simultaneously earning recognition as one of America's most influential youth activists. The auditorium was packed beyond capacity with medical students, professors, hospital administrators, and healthcare advocates who had come to hear her keynote address at the National Conference on Medical Ethics and Social Justice. But Ruby's attention was focused on the front row, where the people who mattered most sat watching with pride that transcended professional achievement. Sarah Whitmore, now 16 and a sophomore at Harvard studying educational psychology, beamed from her seat beside James, who had aged gracefully into a man whose wealth now served justice rather than preserving privilege. Marcus Washington, 13 years old, with a perfectly functioning transplanted heart, sat next to his grandmother Ethel, who at 75 had lived to see her great-granddaughter fulfill dreams that had seemed impossible just years earlier. 5 years ago, I was a homeless girl teaching fractions under an oak tree, Ruby began, her voice carrying clearly through the silent auditorium. Today, I stand before you as living proof that brilliance exists in every community, that talent transcends circumstances, and that the most powerful force for systemic change is often the voice of someone society has trained you not to hear. The speech she delivered that day would be quoted in medical textbooks and played in ethics courses for decades to come, but its power lay not in academic theory, but in lived experience transformed into wisdom. When I was 12 years old, I discovered that my little brother was scheduled to be murdered so his heart could be given to a wealthy family's child, Ruby continued, her words causing visible shock waves through the audience of medical professionals. The same hospital system that was planning Marcus's death had been built with money stolen from my grandfather's cardiac research after he was lynched for the crime of being a brilliant black man in 1983 Alabama. She paused, allowing the magnitude of systemic injustice to settle over the room like a heavy blanket. But this story isn't really about individual villains or heroes. It's about systems that allow some children to live while others die based solely on their family's ability to pay. It's about the moral choices we make when we think nobody is watching, when we believe our actions won't have consequences, when we convince ourselves that maintaining the status quo is more important than protecting the vulnerable. Dr. Patricia Chen, now head of pediatric cardiology at Birmingham Children's Hospital, wiped tears from her eyes as she listened to Ruby articulate the ethical principles that had guided her own transformation from a surgeon who served only wealthy patients to an advocate for universal healthcare access. Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood spent 40 years running from the consequences of abandoning her mixed-race daughter and destroying my grandfather's career, Ruby said, her voice softening with compassion rather than condemnation. But in her final months, she chose courage over comfort, truth over reputation, justice over self-preservation. Her example taught me that redemption isn't about erasing our mistakes. It's about ensuring that our worst moments lead to better choices for future generations. The audience of medical professionals sat in stunned silence as Ruby detailed the scope of changes that had emerged from her family's trauma. The Thomas Washington Medical Justice Act had revolutionized organ transplant procedures, ensuring that financial status could no longer determine who lived or died. The Washington Family Foundation had provided full medical school scholarships to over 200 students from disadvantaged backgrounds, creating a generation of physicians committed to serving underserved communities. Today, Marcus is a healthy 13-year-old who wants to become a pediatric surgeon, Ruby continued, gesturing toward her brother. Sarah Whitmore is studying to become an educational advocate for children with learning differences. James Whitmore has transformed his family's wealth from a source of guilt into an instrument of justice. And Mrs. Blackwood's legacy lives on through the Thomas Washington Academy, where children of all backgrounds learn together as equals. But Ruby's most powerful message came when she addressed the medical professionals directly, challenging them to examine their own roles in perpetuating or dismantling systemic inequality. How many Ruby Washingtons are sitting in your emergency rooms right now, watching their family members receive substandard care because they lack insurance or social connections? How many brilliant minds are being dismissed because they come from zip codes you've been taught to distrust? How many children are dying from treatable conditions because our medical system treats health care as a commodity rather than a human right? The questions hung in the air like surgical instruments, precise and cutting. Dr. Martinez, now Director of Community Health Initiatives at Detroit General Hospital, stood to address Ruby directly. Miss Washington, your courage in exposing the organ trafficking conspiracy saved hundreds of lives and transformed how we approach medical ethics education. But beyond the systemic changes, how do you personally process the trauma of what your family experienced? Ruby's response revealed the wisdom that had emerged from surviving impossible circumstances. Dr. Martinez, trauma is like scar tissue. It never completely disappears, but it can become a source of strength rather than weakness, she replied. Every time I see a child in a hospital bed, I remember Marcus lying unconscious while doctors planned his murder. Every time I study cardiac procedures, I feel my grandfather's presence guiding my understanding. Every time I advocate for healthcare justice, I honor Mrs. Blackwood's final choice to tell the truth despite the personal cost. She paused, looking out at the sea of faces that represented the future of American medicine. The scar tissue from our family's trauma has become the foundation for my commitment to ensuring that no child ever again dies from treatable conditions due to poverty, that no brilliant mind is wasted due to educational inequality, that no family faces the choice between bankruptcy and watching their loved ones die. As Ruby concluded her address, the standing ovation lasted for 7 minutes. But the real measure of her impact came in the weeks and months that followed as medical schools across the country revised their curricula to include mandatory courses on healthcare equity, as hospitals implemented new policies ensuring equal treatment regardless of patients' economic status, as a generation of young physicians committed themselves to serving the most vulnerable members of society. The Washington Family Foundation announced that Ruby's medical school tuition would be fully covered, with the understanding that she would spend her residency working in underserved communities. But more significantly, they established the Ruby Washington Scholarship Program, providing full medical education funding to students who committed to practicing in low-income areas for at least 5 years after graduation. Sarah Whitmore's research on educational methods for neurodiverse learners had been accepted for publication in the Journal of Educational Psychology, making her the youngest person ever to appear in that prestigious publication. Her work built directly on the teaching techniques Ruby had developed under the oak tree at Whitmore Academy, proving that innovative pedagogy often emerges from necessity rather than formal training. Marcus Washington's recovery had exceeded all medical expectations. His transplanted heart functioned perfectly, his energy levels were normal, and his dream of becoming a surgeon seemed entirely achievable. But perhaps, most importantly, his survival had become a symbol of what was possible when medical care was driven by healing rather than profit. The oak tree where Ruby and Sarah had first met still stood in the courtyard of the Thomas Washington Academy, now surrounded by a memorial garden dedicated to children whose potential had been destroyed by systemic discrimination. Students gathered there daily to study, teach each other, and continue the work of educational justice that had begun with 2 girls from different worlds discovering their shared humanity. As Ruby prepared to begin her medical training, she carried with her the knowledge that her grandfather's vision of healing as social justice lived on through her commitment to serving others. The girl who had once pressed her face against academy fences had become living proof that brilliance transcends circumstances, that justice can emerge from tragedy, and that the most powerful force for positive change is often the voice of someone brave enough to tell the truth about what needs to be healed. In a nation still struggling with the legacy of racial inequality and economic injustice, Ruby Washington represented the possibility of transformation. Not through denial of historical trauma, but through the courage to face it honestly and build something better from the broken pieces of the past. The American dream, it turned out, was not about individual success in isolation, but about the collective commitment to ensuring that every child, regardless of race, class, or background, had the opportunity to develop their gifts, contribute to their communities, and participate in the ongoing work of creating a more perfect union. Sometimes the most expensive education does come free, delivered by teachers who understand that true wisdom is measured not by credentials earned, but by lives changed, not by wealth accumulated, but by justice served, not by status achieved, but by barriers broken down for those who follow. And sometimes the richest families are indeed built not on money, but on the radical act of choosing love over fear, truth over comfort, and hope over the bitter certainties that have divided us for too long.